welcome back to the Windsor, Essex Anti-Hate Youth Collective podcast. We're so excited to be debuting another part of our program where we talk about important issues, trends, and topics regarding race, ethnicity, and identity. In this episode, we have our project coordinator, Vanessa Bumanlag, joined by
Deepashika Senaratne,
a Windsor, Essex Anti-Hate Youth Collective executive member and a current student at the University of Windsor, in discussing the lived experiences of representation in the media, diverse voices in the media, and its impact. So, Deepashika, do you want to do a quick introduction about who you are, what you're doing at the center, and how you became to be an executive member?
Sure. So I am currently going into my fourth year of biochem at the University of Windsor, and I am an exec member of the Anti-Hate Youth Collective and currently working as a summer student here at the South Asian Center of Windsor. I first joined the Anti-Hate Youth Collective because I really wanted to make a difference in Windsor and try to eradicate hate so that Windsor can be a safer and better place for everyone to live.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. And once again, the host of the podcast, my name is Vanessa Bumanlag. I am the current project coordinator of the Anti-Hate Youth Collective. I've been graciously given this position by the South Asian Center of Windsor, and we have been doing a lot of things for preparation for our upcoming fiscal year, and we're so excited to debut and start new projects with the Anti-Hate Youth Collective. So as we spoke about before, we're going to be talking about diverse voices in media. So things that we saw while growing up, how we feel represented as South Asian women, Southeast Asian women, and how that's impacted our lives. So Deepashika, for you, growing up, did you have anyone that you really looked up to, particularly within media, whether that be YouTube, gaming, different types of media like Instagram? And if you did, what kind of shows did you watch growing up and that kind of stuff?
So representation in the media obviously is a really complex issue, and I don't think that growing up I had anyone that looked exactly like me, which is unfortunate, and I'm glad that that's changing. And in terms of what shows I watched, probably didn't help much, but I was watching mostly like animated things and cartoons, so diversity and representation looks a bit different when you're in that kind of medium.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that I really noticed, at least with me growing up, is that especially in like the little like kiddish cartoons, I never really seen anybody who looked like me, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I grew up watching a lot of Strawberry Shortcake, for an example. I loved Strawberry Shortcake as a kid. The only thing that I could really think of that really set the milestone for, I think, especially because I would say that we identify as like brown. I may be white skinned, but like we're brown at heart. Was Dora the Explorer. So it was one of the things.
Really?
Yeah, I was gonna say. So I feel like that's one of them that really like paved the way. I feel like that was one of like I know that I think she's Hispanic or she's Spanish.
I think so.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and like that really paved the way, I feel like, for representation. But a lot of the times I felt like, at least in media for me personally, that there's almost like this stereotypical like Asian representation in like common media. Mm-hmm. So although we were always like included, it was very stereotypical in nature. So we would commonly be used as like Asian punchlines, or there'd be the commonality of like strict Asian parents with some people's. Like I found that a lot of like child's television and like teen television, that mm-hmm. like the Asian best friend would always have really strict parents, and they wouldn't really expand anything past that. So it's kind of reinforcing those stereotypes that we see in popular media. So I don't know, I wouldn't say I didn't feel represented, because I did see a few people like myself growing up, but it wasn't a positive representation. So there was always a stereotypical so to speak aspect of it. So I know that like we talk about, especially right now with shows, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with like Euphoria, with Zendaya being like the first main character, mm-hmm. Who is part of the 2S LGBTQIA community, and then there's Ginny and Georgia, who is also part of the Black community, and Zendaya is too, with Ginny being a part of that. I feel like representation kind of has switched from more of a focus. I feel like companies, especially now too, with how careful in how constructive they're being with in terms of diversity and equity. They're being a little bit more open towards envisioning people, like not just white characters itself, but also including Black characters, Asian characters, that kind of stuff. How do you feel representation has switched from what you've seen as a child to what you've seen now as kind of, I'm going to say an adult, not to age you, but as an adult?
As an old lady, why don't we just go all the way there? So I think it's really interesting that we're seeing more diverse characters and more diverse cultures represented, and I appreciate that. But I think there's a line that exists where it's almost, I don't want to say too much diversity, because that's not the perspective and the angle, but it's almost a token diversity where they just include characters that are they are functionally white in their characterization, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
But they just have like an appearance that happens to match a minority character.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that has to do with, like, one of the things that I think one of the critiques that we've done, at least with the research that we did with this episode, was that a lot of people, like what you said, they're casted in these roles when they're, you know, they say blah, 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 as there's a brown lead woman or there's a Black lead woman, but they're not effective in storytelling the trials and like the challenges that we go through as minority women, so, or minority men. So I think that, I'm assuming that's what you're getting at, where it's kind of like white storytelling. And the problem with me personally is, and with the strike that's happening with the Hollywood writers right now, is that you have all these people that are writing stories, that are writing amazing scripts, but they're all told in a white man's perspective. Let's be real. Like, a lot of people, a lot of Hollywood writers are white men. And when you have a white male trying to describe the experiences of a brown Southeast Asian woman, it's just inauthentic. And I feel like there needs to be room for, I think, growth within writers to have that storytelling aspect to it. Just because, like what you said, I think it's inauthentic, and I don't think that it's genuine towards what we face and what we see in, like, our lives, for an example. So, and then another thing that I realized too, like, especially with me being, like I'm Filipino, and, like, I feel like there's almost, like, an erasure of, like, Asian representation in Hollywood almost, where it's, like, it's either Asian stereotypical, like, yellow fishing, whitewashing, that kind of stuff, or it's just someone else. Like, there's no inclusion of, like, Asian characters that really, like, have that storytelling aspect of it, where we see, like, for an example, an upbringing of a lot of, like, people from, like, the Black community being represented, which is great. But once again, comes that nuance of, like, those experiences aren't being told authentically from that representation and from that group. So the next topic I kind of wanted to go into a little bit was like whitewashing and yellow facing. So for those who may not know, yellow face dates back to the early forms when ethnic white actors would darken their face features and use prosthetics in costumes to appear Asian. The term came from similar acts of blackface that were popular when white actors colored their skin to caricature Black people and Black culture. So even with representation, I feel as though especially Asian people are constantly in the background of many TV shows with a total lack of representation or more stereotypical styles on TV. So we see there's a lot of, like, movies that were based in, like, Japan or something, that you could see that white actors would add, like, prosthetics to their face. Like, this is years ago, but white actors would add things to their face to make them look more yellow, or you'd see people use fake accents in order to sound quote unquote Asian. So there's things like that, I feel like, in the media that kind of sprawl out into society that make these jokes and the stereotypical jokes okay almost. That's why people, when you hear about Asian racism, maybe that sometimes they don't take it as seriously, and there's, like, an erasure of that, except for the fact that they play, like, stereotypical roles on, like, social media, and they play stereotypical roles in, like, media and TV shows. So one of the things, I don't know how maybe you've seen, but some of the things that really came up for me, especially when researching about this topic specifically, was Han Lee from Two Broke Girls. So have you ever watched Two Broke Girls?
I actually have not.
It's a really, like, trashy show, in my opinion. It's very misogynistic, stereotypical. Like, it was very, I don't know if you remember this, like 2015 humor, 2014 humor, where people were like using edge as like humor when it wasn't. Now you look back on it, it's just misogynistic, racist, and like rooted in like stereotypes. So Han Lee from Two Broke Girls, he owns the diner, I believe. I don't know much about the TV show. I just know of it because I see TikTok videos of it all the time. But the two women in there are constantly berating him, making fun of him for being Asian, for an example. They'll talk about his height as an example. It's just like stuff that like they pull that are like stereotypical, him being cheap because he's Asian, that kind of stuff. So seeing that, I think within the media really perpetrates why people like expect that from Asians, especially within the culture as well, because it like manifests itself into what people think. One of the research articles that I was reading about this topic is that a lot of people, if they haven't had a lot of contact with specific groups, so if you live in a white suburban neighborhood, barely with any diversity, a lot of people, what they'll do is internalize what they see on media from those types of groups and make judgments based on that. So when we see like the Black community being extortionized into criminals or people who create the problem of crime, and then Asian people, the joke people, the people who started the coronavirus, that kind of stuff, and people who are doctors, people, when they're watching popular media and they don't have a lot of contact with those groups, will take those stereotypes and use them for the next time they come into contact with them, which is not great, obviously.
Right.
I don't know if you had any other like TV shows that you kind of saw that kind of depicted maybe your specific like ethnicity or your nationality like in a negative way or even like a positive way.
I'm from Sri Lanka, which means that my culture is like almost a minority within a minority, because we're related to, I guess, South India would be like the closest analog in terms of popular culture, if that makes sense. So I've actually I haven't seen many Sri Lankan actors or actresses depicted in like popular media, but what I do know is that there's actually like media produced in Sri Lanka that I watch, and that's like the form of representation, but that comes with its own issues. Yeah.
No, for sure, definitely. And like I feel like even with my family growing up, my sister would constantly watch like they're not called K-dramas, but they're Filipino dramas, and it's basically the same kind of concept, but like a lot of the times, at least with the media that her and I were consuming through, we used to have like a little box that used to like have like a bunch of Filipino dramas on it. At least with what we got, like it was just stereotypical, like girl falls in love with boy, and then their friend group has drama. And it's never, like, talking about, like, at least for me, like, I'm half white, half Asian, but that struggle of assimilating into either culture and trying to fit in with a group of people, and it doesn't really, like, highlight that kind of stuff. It's always, like, and we get into this later on in the episode, but the hypersexualization of, like, women, and, like, the only choice that women have is which boy are they going to pick, and it's not just that. Like, we have so much more going else for our life that it's not just men.
Oh my gosh.
But yeah, and then another thing, like, people would argue that, I don't know if you ever watched Freaky Friday with Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan.
I did a while ago.
Yeah, me too.
It's been a long time.
Trust me, I haven't watched in a long time. Like, this is like, I watched it maybe when I was like 8, 9 years old. I never watched it again.
That's around the same time I watched it.
I never watched it again because I'm not really into that kind of media. But anyways, one of the things, like, that really, like, I guess as an adult that, like, I internalized as a child was at the Chinese restaurant. The whole plot of it was that, like, they switched bodies out of magic in the Chinese restaurant. And, like, I know, and this it's almost like this weird, like, tokenism of, like, exoticism where it's like, oh, we have magic at our restaurant. It was, like, even the actresses who played, like, as the waiters in the Chinese restaurant were wearing stereotypical Chinese clothes, talking that way, making stereotypical Chinese jokes. So it wasn't, like, something that was, like, paying homage to something that exists, for an example. It was more like, this is what Hollywood thinks of Chinese people, and this is, like, a funny, like, depiction of them, because, like, where else would this happen where they switch bodies? Obviously the Chinese restaurant. So just one of those things that, like, once again reinforces the negative stereotypes of Asian people. and we're almost used as, like, I like to tell this to people all the time, is that we're used as, like, the laughing stock or, like, the punchline, and then we aren't really taken seriously as, like, actresses or actors. The only times that I actually ever seen that was, like, in some of the, for an example, we'll talk about this later in the episode, was, like, Jenny Han, for an example. I don't know if you know any of her books.
I do, actually.
I was gonna say.
I read To All the Boys I Loved Before.
Awesome. Yep, that's in there. I was gonna say, yeah, no, sorry, continue.
No, and I loved the way that she actually represented, like, what it's like to be one of the only, like, Asian people in your entire school, or even, like, what it's like to kind of assimilate and to navigate being, like, I've heard the term third culture kid, and I really like it, because you're essentially of a third culture, right? You have two cultures that support you, but realistically you're in this, like, weird middle ground that you have to kind of navigate all by yourself.
Yeah, for sure. And, like, I mean, might as well, like, while we're on this topic, kind of jump to it anyways, but I talk about, like, the only positive representations that I personally could have thought of, like, I just finished, I don't know if you watched Jenny Han's on Amazon Prime Video. They have the first season out for The Summer I Turned Pretty. It's a live action.
I haven't.
It's really good.
Want to, though.
It's really good. I didn't know it was on there until, like, I was watching TikTok and it came up. Someone's like, you can watch it on Prime. And I was like, I have Prime. Let's go watch it. And I really liked how, once again, they kind of touched on, like, for me, like, I really resonated with it because the girl that plays, I'm forgetting her name, the one in The Summer I Turned Pretty. Oh, they call her Belly. Her name's Isabella. I know her nickname. Her name's Isabella. Her nickname is Belly. But the girl who plays Belly looks like she is Asian. Like, she's very much a visible minority. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, I really wish that me growing up, I had something like this, because this is cool. And, like, you never see, like, for an example, as much as, like, this is, like, kind of dumb for saying this, but when growing up and seeing all these, like, love-based teenager stories, the main character is always white. Literally every time. And they'll have the quirky, especially Disney's notorious for doing this, is that they'll have, like, the quirky side character that's either Asian or black. Right. Because, like, you know, they're not meant to be taken seriously. So, I'm trying to think of that one TV show that I watched. There's a lot of them, but Disney's notorious for doing that, where it's like, oh, that's funny. The only time I've ever seen the roles switched was in Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, where Maddie was the smart one, and then the Asian person was, like, quote-unquote, the dumb one.
London?
Yeah, London Tipton. So, but yeah, it was nice to see, like, that being represented. And, like, another thing that I thought was really cool, and I haven't seen in Jenny Han's To All the Boys I Loved Before, was the adaptation of, they talked about racism and poverty actually in the show, which was nice. And they touched on, I think it was Isabella's older brother, I think his name's Steven. I don't remember. I think it's Steven though. Really hope it is, or else I'm going to be wrong. But Steven ends up working at, like, and this is a spoiler alert, but I highly doubt anyone's going to watch it, but he starts working at, like, the beach house club, and he gets promoted to, like, helping out with all, like, the old rich white men that are, like, playing poker in the basement. And they ask him for help on poker, and they're saying, oh, how he's good at math, and they can make very slide comments about him being Asian, right? And then there's a scene in him in the kitchen, him, like, counting the money, and you can see that he's, like, debating, like, mentally of, like, what happened to him, right? And he knew something was wrong when he was, like, faced with what they were saying about him. I don't remember the exact quote, but I remember they said something stereotypical about him being good at math and that kind of stuff, and, like, saying something about racism. And the one guy who was working with him, I think he was Latino, and he said, you know what, like, don't worry about what they say, that's part of the job. As long as you just take their money, it's fine. Who cares what those white guys think? And it was kind of like, that's, I feel like, a way that is sad almost, because we feel as though, like, once again, you see intersectionality when it comes at play, when you see a poor Asian boy trying to just make it through the summer, just trying to, like, you know, afford his classes for when he goes to college, and you see all these, like, rich, powerful, quote-unquote, white men who want to extort that and make fun of that and take that to their advantage. So I feel like there's, like, a really big, like, aspect of power dynamic that comes in there with intersectionality. So not only it's racism, it's poverty, there's a lot of, like, intersectionality that comes across with that particular scene. So I don't know if you want to touch on To All the Boys I've Loved Before. I know you said that you read that. I really liked the main actress, personally that was playing in like the roles, and I like how Jenny Han consistently always hires predominantly only Asian actresses, so I like that. But I'll let you touch on that topic a little bit. But
I'm not sure what to say about it. The thing I was impressed with the most was just how they actually addressed how her culture affected her relationships, which isn't something we see too often. I think, because it's been a while since I've read this book as well, I think a better show that I'd be suited to talk about is, it's a comic book adaptation called Invincible, and the main character is Asian American, and I really, and actually he's biracial. His mom is Asian, his dad is, like, I guess white, and they do a really good job of portraying his struggles as, like, an Asian American, and as well as just not having that be the central focus of the show, which is almost rare for fantasy stories, especially because usually in fantasy stories you don't often get the chance to explore what, you know, the relationships between culture and just intersectionality in general, I guess.
Yeah, no, for sure. And like I feel like especially with like the way people are trying to be quote unquote more cognizant of like equity and diversity and inclusivity, is that it's either the show doesn't talk about it, there's a spectrum, the show talks about it, the show talks about it for a second, and they're like, oh, we solved racism, this is amazing. And then they go, or it's just the show is completely all about it, and then the point where people don't want to watch it because they think it's like quote unquote social justice warrior type stuff. So another thing that I don't know if you ever watched too was Never Have I Ever. It just ended, the last season just came out. Have you watched it? With I don't know how to pronounce her name. I know she's very strict on getting people to pronounce her name, but the actress that plays oh my god, I'm drawing a blank here. What's her name?
I know who you're talking about, and it's really frustrating because I'm also forgetting her name.
I know the actress's name because like I love her and I follow her on Instagram, but like I can't remember the girl's name in the Davy. That's her name, Davy. I was gonna say, I was like trying to think of it. It started with a D and I was like, I can't remember. It's not Denise, it's Davy. But yeah, and like I feel like they have a really good way of incorporating. So it's stereotypical with like the love stories, obviously, because like that's what sells with like teenagers and like Netflix.
Issue. That's a separate issue at this point.
But they think they do a pretty good job on bringing in aspects of her culture into the show itself without it being so in your face. Like, do you know what I mean? And I think it's nice to see another great show that doesn't necessarily just solely focus on, oh, girl finds guy after girl's dad dies, girl's fixed now. And it focuses, like, the past 4 seasons, I only watched up until, I watched bits and pieces of the 3rd and the 4th season, but I've watched up to the 2nd season. They do a really good job with, like, her character growth as an individual, her accepting, like, at the beginning, at the end of the episode, spoiler alert for anyone who's watching, the last episode where she's dancing, I believe, at her grandma's wedding, and she is performing a traditional like Indian dance at the wedding. I don't remember what it's specifically called, but it's a good contrast from the beginning episode, the first season, in the first season she visits for a festival, and she said, oh, I hate people who represent their culture, like this is like cringy, this is annoying, like I would never do that, I would never like dance as a part of that, and she was making fun of them. But it's nice to see like the character growth, and she goes through losing her father and like losing a part of her culture almost, and then also like internalizing that and being proud eventually about being a woman of color and being an Indian woman, obviously. I believe she's Tamil in real life. I think she is matriarch. I don't know how to say her name. It's something like that, but I like seeing the character growth of her character specifically, and even like her mom too, with like trying to get her to go back to her like roots, for an example, and then you see her move from a stereotypical Asian character where the mom's like strict, don't get along, they always biting on each other's throats, to eventually they getting along and like them understanding each other. So I really like that specifically. So I think like with all of these representations, we're seeing a more realistic expectation and representation of Asian women. I wouldn't say it's perfect, like what we've talked about before with like the over reliance of men, especially in the commonality of these like episodes and like these seasons, but we're seeing more stories that humanize like the diversity of Asian American experiences. And it's nice to see there's less stereotypical depictions, but there's also, even with some stuff that I've seen in particular shows, like I'm like, well, wait a second, like this is not accurate. But we still have like, I feel like a long way to go in terms of that kind of representation. And instead of just casting an Asian person to play a white person's experience and being like, we're diverse, there needs to be more storytelling, like what we talked about women of color, giving them those spaces, because once we, like what we said before, those spaces in Hollywood are predominantly white men that are writing the scripts. That's why I think Never Have I Ever turned out so well, because Mindy Kaling, she's the one who produced it and was helping alongside with that. So that's why I think it was really nice to see that kind of depiction as well. So one of the things that a sociologist, and I think she was a criminalist and sociologist from a university, was saying that, like what we said before, they should really hire Asian writers in the writing room and take their input seriously. So like they're not the removal, I wouldn't say, of white people, I'm not trying to say that, but the addition of Asian writers and being more cognizant of those types of roles, and like removing white writers speaking through the Asian experience voices, because that's inauthentic. Yeah. So for you specifically, is there anything that you would like to see? I guess like for me, I always think about when I see and I develop and what I do is for my kids in like the future. I don't know if that's an end goal for you. I know everyone's a little different, but what do you see for future for representation in terms of like racism and discrimination, or like just media in general in terms of representation?
I think that it's a bit of a long way off at this point in time, but eventually I'd like to see a more intersectional approach, in the sense that someone can be, let's say like Asian American and also queer, or Asian American and also like trans. And I'd like to see more of those experiences represented. I know that there's a lot of really, really interesting work being done, but it's not mainstream, which is unfortunate, because the experiences and the stories are like some of the best stuff I've seen.
Yeah, I think that's like important too, is like another thing is that in terms of representation is that like being more cognizant of like who we cast to. I think one of my hopes as an individual, especially for when I have children and they're going to be obviously minorities, but they're going to be white passing enough because my partner is white, is how we view like model minority status. That's one thing that I really don't like.
I hate the model minority myth.
So I hate that, like, and this is what's common with like the Asian stereotypes that we were talking about before, where they're talking about like, you know, oh, like so-and-so has strict parents, so-and-so can't be themselves and they have to do well in school and they're getting straight A's. It's like that Asian, like, you have to be perfect and you have to have those grades. And I want that to be removed, because it's really problematic and it sets unrealistic expectations even within our culture. I feel like that's sometimes, like, especially for me, kind of like the status quo and like how people perceive your worthiness, but that's like an entire other episode. But I think that writers need to once again bring other people that are like us, that have stories to tell, and adapt them into popular media.
There's kind of a stigma associated with going into the arts in general for people of color, and it doesn't matter if you're Asian or like Arab even, and for some individuals who are Black as well. And I just want to be able to see people that are actually passionate about the arts, because how are we going to get representation unless people actually feel comfortable telling their stories, right? And it's an important issue to think about.
I think that's important too, to kind of like, and I used to tell people this all the time when people are like, oh, I'm going into the arts, it's nothing big, but it's like, unfortunately, like, realistically, not everyone can be doctors, like, not everyone can be lawyers. That was like the two main things for like me growing up, was that, oh, they're a doctor, oh, they're a lawyer, oh, they're like an engineer, like those three, like, oh my god, like, but not everyone needs to fit that, and everyone has a purpose. And if we were all built the same and to do the same thing, it would get boring, right? And like those, we see that in like even years ago when women were allowed to enter the workforce, you see all these white men that are in the workforce that are doctors, and there's no representation there. And that's why a lot of the times, even with my friend who's in nursing is that a lot of the times the diagrams will only be depicted on white bodies, and they can't tell the difference between like diseases and stuff that are present on the body because they've never seen it on a black body or a darker body.
Right.
And it's different than what it looked like on a white patient.
Person, because you know, skin color will actually affect topical diseases, and it's so unfortunate because it's just really frustrating that medical discrimination exists. But I feel like, again, separate issue.
No, for sure. And I think that's just stuff that we need to be, I think, cognizant of, because when people, I feel like when they think of, well, I don't understand why there's such a need to be diverse, but it's like in your own ignorance is the cause of the problem, because if you're turning a blind eye towards it, that's why I'm like not a fan, and this is a very controversial opinion, is I'm not a fan when people say I'm not racist, because a lot of the times when we learn things from like our white predecessor, that stuff, that the knowledge that they brought down is inherently itself racist. So I feel like there's a lot of unlearning to do. Obviously, when people say that, I'm not accusing them of saying like awful things about black people or awful things about Asian people. I'm saying that like a lot of the things institutionally is bound towards racism and systemic racism that have trickled down from the institutions that we have in society, and that needs to be recognized. So but I think that's everything that we had to talk about today. So just wanted to thank everyone once again for joining us for our podcast, talking about a little bit of everything. I feel like diverse voices in media, representation, our personal favorites with media, and even like medical terminology and that kind of stuff. Like I think we did a lot today. But Deepashika, any plans for the future for you in terms of where you're headed and anything you want to leave off with?
Fun fact, I am interested in the medical field, and I do intend to be a doctor, so
awesome.
I will be contributing to diversity in that way.
Awesome. And once again, thank you so much everyone for following us, and thank you Deepashika for joining me here today. Next episode, we're hoping to have an individual from the actual community join us, hopefully. And you can join us next time on our podcast, and feel free to follow us at our Instagram. It's at WE Anti-Hate Youth Collective. And then if you're looking to get involved, you can send us an email through clicking the link in the Instagram bio. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today, and have a great week.